This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guests are Joseph Hickman, former Army Staff Sergeant, stationed at Guantánamo for a year, beginning in March of 2006. He's just published a new book. It's called Murder at Camp Delta, a staff sergeant's pursuit of the truth about Guantanamo Bay. We're also joined by Mark Dembo, professor at Seton Hall University School of Law and the director of its Center for Policy and Research, co-author of a new report, Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab.
So, Mark Dembo, you've worked on this issue of what happened that night of June 9th, 2006 in Guantanamo for many years. You've also worked with Joseph Hickman on this. And your research center has just come out with a new report called Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab. Could you lay out what you find in this report?
Yeah. Our investigation over this period of time first found that the NCIS report could not have been a credible, legitimate process. So our next question was, and we published something on that called Death at Camp Delta. The next question was, how could it have been so incompetent? It was one thing, as a student said, to imagine people who killed people would want to cover it up, but why would investigative bodies cover up deaths? And we did our second report, was called Uncovering the Cover-Ups, which came out last summer. But the real question still was, what's the motive? And it turns out that the motive that we found, which was before the Senate report came out, was quite clear that the general in charge of the camp had been placed there by the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in February of 2002. The general who thought he was in charge of the camp, a General Baucus, who was an MP, who was applying the Geneva Convention, a general in charge of detention, an MP. And he, as a general in charge of detention, he was applying the Geneva Conventions. He was removed, and General Dunleavy replaced him, followed by General Miller. General Dunleavy has, under oath, said that he got his marching orders directly from the President of the United States, requiring him to meet in person once a week with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. And General Dunleavy and his successor, General Miller, have both repeatedly characterized Guantanamo as America's battle lab.
And what does that mean?
Well, the best thing that we've been able to figure out when we started that phrase caught everybody's attention. And so the first thing that we looked into was, what were the experiments there? And we were able to find and discover some of the laboratory experiments were there, including giving them drugs that would cause psychotic breaks for up to 30 days as soon as they arrived, and a variety of other things that were given to them over a long period of time.
Which had never been used in any other context before.
The drug they used, they claimed, was to help with malaria. However, there is no malaria in Guantanamo, there is no malaria in Cuba, and every person who was brought there had already had a medical examination in Afghanistan and was proven to have no contagious diseases. So it was a psychotic, really inducing drug, which had been used for a considerable period of time by other sources in order to break down the state of mind of the people.
Professor Dembo, you're saying that this camp was used to experiment on people.
Yes. That's what General Dunleavy referred to when he referred to it as America's Battle Lab. That's what General Miller was referring to when he described Guantanamo as America's Battle Lab, and he was Dunleavy's successor. The only question was, what were the experiments? And of course, the question became fairly clear once we discovered this giving of these psychotic-inducing drugs. They gave them the minute people arrived.
So go back to that night of June 9th,
Yes.
2006 into June 10th.
Yes.
We've just heard Staff Sergeant Joseph Hickman describe what he saw as the prisoners were taken away. What did you come to understand?
Well, he contacted us 3 days after President Obama was inaugurated with describing something that seemed implausible. It was simply counterintuitive to imagine that these people had died as he reported them. And we spent 2 days interviewing him, and we were still somewhat skeptical. And our students then took the NCIS report that had come out, which was 1,700 pages of jumbled, redacted doctrines, and went through it. And it took them 3 months to go through it. And they would make little discoveries that would sort of support Joseph's position. One was they all had rigor mortis when they came in the clinic, Well, how could you have rigor mortis if you're hanging in a cell being watched by 5 guards, and there are 24 people being watched by 5 guards, and they were supposed to see them every 3 minutes? Once they found that, the students sort of began to peel layers away. They discovered the only guards who had ever reported that the detainees were dead hanging in their cells prior to making that statement had been formally advised they had their Miranda rights, they'd made false statements prior to that, and that if they had a right to counsel and a right to remain silent. Instead, they repeated the story that Admiral Harris had said 4 days earlier. One of my students said, why would you have every one of the witnesses to the event have to have a formal Miranda warning document that they had to sign? And another student said, well, if they've made false statements to NCIS before that, where are the false statements in the file? And when nobody could find those false statements, it just led to information piling up after piling up. And I think that we used to joke, we had a student named Kelly, and if Kelly was from Kansas, and our view was if Kelly would buy a hostile negative conclusion, then it had to be true. And Kelly ended up concluding that they didn't hang themselves in their cells, and if they didn't, it couldn't be suicide. And so Kelly from Kansas ended up convincing everybody on the group that we had to at least go so far as to say the NCIS investigation was not credible, and then she ended up coming up with the title called Death in Camp Delta. Nobody wanted to call it murder, because we didn't know, but nobody could believe it was suicide, so their compromise, trying to be careful, was Death in Camp Delta. And we brought that to Scott Horton with Joe Hickman, and Scott then went further and took the entire investigation and did the first report.
Yeah, so when Scott Horton's Harper's piece first appeared, called The Guantanamo Suicides, it was published in January 2010, it came under some criticism. The piece was, of course, based in large part on Joseph Hickman's testimony. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service said in response to the piece, quote, according to the Harper's article, Sergeant Hickman was stationed on the exterior perimeter of the camp, including Tower 1, the night of the detainees' deaths. From this location, he had no visibility into the cell block and cells where the deaths occurred, a fact confirmed by FBI and DOJ investigators who were specifically tasked to look into Sergeant Hickman's allegations. NCIS conducted over 100 interviews during the first 3 days of the investigation, including interviews with all the guards who worked in the cell block that day and all the detainees who were housed there. None of those interviewed told of any detainees being taken away or alleged homicide. Joseph Hickman, could you respond to that criticism of what they say you were able to witness or see then that night, June 9th, 2006?
Sure. One thing, the NCIS, or in their response, they told at best a half-truth about where I was and what my duties were. Yes, I did have responsibilities on the perimeter of Camp Delta, but I also had responsibilities inside Camp Delta. And actually probably more than 50% of my time was spent inside of the camp, where they try to say he was just a perimeter guard, where the other time I was spent outside in the perimeter. So that night, I was inside Camp Delta. I was in the camp. I was 35 to 40 feet away from the medical clinic. I had 3 guards, at best 25 meters away from the medical clinic. I had another guard directly in a tower, directly looking at Camp 1, the walkway in Camp 1. I had a total of 7 guards that had they could visually see Camp 1 and the medical clinic and had a clear, unobstructed view. And none of those guards were interviewed by NCIS.
None of those guards were interviewed, the ones who were able to see whether the prisoners were taken away?
The tower guards, the eyes in the sky, none of them were interviewed. The guards that were posted just across the street from the medical clinic, none of them were interviewed. They would be the first one you would interview. And for them to say that I was a perimeter guard, it threw a lot of people off, and that's where the criticism came from. And I don't blame the people that criticized me, because they're taking their word. But I also think the thing is being the unique position I had where I was in the camp and outside the camp on certain duties, it gave me an even more, it gave me a better position to even tell what was going on, because I could leave Camp Delta and see where that van was going. I could go inside of Camp Delta and see the detainees being loaded into the van. The position actually was beneficial, not how they tried to explain it.
Well, Joseph,
Mark
when you
Dembo.
first... Oh, sorry.
Yes. One of the important things about the statement, because they were critical of Joe and of our report, one of their critical statements was that where Joe was, he couldn't see into the cells. And that's really a very disingenuous statement, because Sergeant Hickman never said he could see into the cells. What he said was he was standing by the clinic where, if they had been brought from the cells, found dead hanging in their cells, they would have had to walk within 10 yards of him. And he, in fact, so he was in a place to show the bodies were never brought into the clinic from the camp.
Well, Joseph Hickman, when you first, when you noticed these discrepancies, you took them first to the Department of Justice. How did they respond to your concerns about what happened that night?
I met two FBI agents, and I met an attorney two attorneys from the Department of Justice at Seton Hall Law School, with my attorney Josh Dembo and Professor Mark Dembo. And we sat and spoke for about 3 hours. They seemed very interested in what happened. They asked a lot of questions, and I was really encouraged by their interest in what I was telling them.
Joseph Hickman, who was your favorite president?
Ronald Reagan.
And you were the first officer on the camp to have soldiers open fire on the prisoners during an uprising among them?
Yes, I'm a sergeant. I'm actually enlisted. I'm not an officer, but yes, I was the first. I was the first one to ever give the order to fire on detainees.
Did your view of the camp change, or of the prison change? How did it change in that year that you were there?
Well, it's a big culture shock when you get to Guantanamo the first time and you're overseeing detainees and you're seeing how they live. It was a difficult, uncomfortable place to be. And you look down, you first get there and you see these detainees housed in these 6x8 cells, and you know they've been there for years, living in these cells for years, getting 1 hour rec time a week. You know there's some serious human rights issues. And it did affect me, and it was the first place I was ever stationed that, every soldier takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It was the first duty station I was ever at where I actually started questioning, was I breaking my oath?
And, Mark Dembo, from the investigations that you've done on what happened that night, do you have any sense of, were these people, the 3 detainees who died, were they deliberately targeted, or was it an experiment gone wrong?
Well, I guess the answer is I don't know. I mean, 3 people died under circumstances that were different from the investigative report. I think probably the closest I can get to is trying to figure out what the motive would be for these cover-ups and these false statements. And I think my own view is a legitimate investigation into what would have caused their deaths and answered your question. Was it deliberate, was it accidental, would apparently have revealed a great deal of other activities that were taking place in Guantanamo that would have been something that our administration at that time would never have wanted to be revealed. They certainly wouldn't have wanted to show that Guantanamo was an intelligence operation, not a detention facility. I've always wondered why they would bring 779 of the most dangerous people in the world closer to the United States. And of course, it turns out that the answer was it was part of this program that began with marching orders directly from President Bush. So I've concluded that we don't know why or how they died by an experiment or otherwise, but an investigation into that would have answered that question, but it also would have revealed things that General Dunleavy and General Miller inadvertently revealed later on.
And Sergeant Joseph Hickman, You knew at that time that prisoners were taken away from where you were if they wanted to break them or turn them to be CIA assets. Is that right?
I did not know that at the time. I did occasionally see detainees transported prior to June 9th to Camp No, but I didn't know at the time that they were doing that operation.
And so what have you come to conclude right now about what this prison represents? You know, one of the recordings that's come out in the horror that took place in Paris was Koulibaly, the man who opened fire in the kosher supermarket, speaking, sort of ranting in the supermarket because a reporter called up and he picked up the phone, thought he hung it up, but they were able to record what he was saying. He referred to ISIS, he referred to Iraq, and he also said, it was a little hard to understand, but stop unveiling our women, stop putting our brothers in prison for everything and anything. What Guantanamo has come to represent. In the United States, they're using it to say we can never close it now, especially Republicans who are against the closure of Guantanamo, because we need it for terrorists. But what you now see, it's come to represent in the rest of the world.
Well, it makes, I mean, we pride ourselves on human rights, and this is ridiculous. We have a place that breaks so many human rights. It's ridiculous. I don't think there should be a Guantanamo. I think people should be charged for crimes, but I think it should be here in the United States.
Do you think Guantanamo threatens our national security?
Yes. I think it breeds terrorism.
In what way?
Well, I think the recidivism numbers I think are wrong that they come out with. But if you take a guy that was sent to Guantanamo off of a bounty from another tribe, and he sits there for 10, 12 years, his family comes to hate the United States. He himself hates the United States. When he gets out, how are these people going to respond to what we did to him?
Last question is about another prisoner, the prisoner whose name is Shakar Amr. It happened the same night. It happened on June 9th, 2006. His attorney, Zachary Katznelson, described the torture of Amr in a federal filing. Scott Horton excerpted the statement. He said, Amr was beaten for 2.5 hours straight. 7 naval military police participated in his beating. Amr stated he'd refused to provide a retina scan and fingerprints. He reported to me he was strapped to a chair, fully restrained at the head, arms, and leg. The military police inflicted so much pain, Mr. Amr said he thought he was going to die. This is the same night as the other 3 prisoners died. Do you know about this?
Yes. I obtained a document, actually. And the detainee, Shakar Amr, if you notice in the affidavit, there is a lot of similarities to the 3 that did die. There was a mask put on his face. There was it was a lot of similarities, blockage of the airway, several things. It was pretty shocking when we discovered that.
I want to thank you for being with us. Is there any last statement you'd like to make, having written your book, Murder at Camp Delta, having served at Guantanamo, in light of what has taken place now in the world? Joseph Hickman speaking to us from Green Bay.
Well, I'd just like to say that I wrote this book so the truth could come out, and if people will notice, I dedicated it to Khalil al-Zurani. It is the father of one of the detainees who has always questioned the U.S. government's version of what happened that night. And I hope in some way this answers some questions and in an odd way give him some peace so he knows the truth.
Joseph Hickman, thanks so much for being with us. Former Army Staff Sergeant stationed at Guantanamo from March 2006 for the following year. He's just written a book called Murder at Camp Delta, a staff sergeant's pursuit of the truth about Guantanamo Bay. And Mark Dembo, thanks for being with us, professor at Seton Hall University School of Law, director of the Center for Policy and Research, co-author of the new report, Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. When we